I left town for a week. HOA bulldozed my house. Then the judge made them rebuild it and pay me $10 million. How could someone leave for just 1 week and come back to something like this? And what could possibly lead a judge to order such an extraordinary outcome? If stories like this keep you hooked, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what would you do if you came home and found your house gone? It all started with what was supposed to be an ordinary drive home, until one unexpected sight changed everything I thought I knew. A house is more than walls. It is every memory that refuses to disappear. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the peaceful kind that settles over a quiet neighborhood on a warm Texas afternoon, but the strange emptiness left behind when something familiar is suddenly missing. I slowed my pickup truck as I turned onto Maple Ridge Lane, expecting to see the wide front porch that had greeted me for nearly 15 years. Instead, all I saw was sunlight pouring across an open stretch of dirt where my home should have been. For a moment, my mind refused to accept what my eyes were seeing. My name is Nathan Brooks. I am 42 years old, and I have spent my entire career as a structural engineer. I know exactly how foundations are poured, how beams carry weight, and how buildings stand against time. Yet nothing in my professional life prepared me for the impossible sight waiting at the end of my own driveway. The familiar oak tree still stood proudly near the sidewalk, its branches swaying gently in the summer breeze. My black mailbox leaned slightly to one side exactly where I had left it before flying to Arizona for a 7-day bridge inspection project. The stone walkway leading from the curb remained untouched. But beyond that, everything else had vanished. The smell hit me next. Freshly broken concrete mixed with damp soil, splintered lumber, and the sharp scent of diesel fuel lingering in the warm air. Dust still drifted lazily across the empty lot as though the ground itself had not yet settled after whatever had happened here. I stepped out of my truck without even shutting off the engine. My boots crunched over scattered gravel and tiny fragments of brick that had once been part of my living room fireplace. Every few steps I recognized another piece of my life. A section of white porch railing, part of the stone chimney, blue ceramic tile from my kitchen floor. None of it made sense. I looked around expecting someone to explain that I had somehow driven to the wrong address, but every neighboring house stood exactly where it belonged. Mrs. Henderson's flower garden still stretched beneath her front windows. The Johnson family basketball hoop still leaned slightly over their driveway. Everything was exactly the same except the one house that should have been standing directly in front of me. A heavy bulldozer rested behind temporary orange construction fencing, its engine finally silent after what looked like a long day of work. Nearby, workers loaded broken lumber into large dumpsters while another crew swept dust from the pavement as if this were nothing more than an ordinary construction site. One man wearing a bright reflective safety vest noticed me staring across the empty foundation. He walked toward me holding a clipboard with the calm expression of someone simply finishing another routine assignment. "Can I help you?" he asked politely. I swallowed hard before answering. "This is my house." He looked down at his paperwork, then back at me without any sign of surprise. "The demolition was authorized through the Homeowners Association." His words hung in the hot afternoon air while I continued staring at the empty space where my entire life had been only 1 week earlier. Deep inside, I realized this was not a mistake that could be explained with a simple conversation. Someone had made a decision. Someone believed they had the authority to erase my home while I was gone. They had removed the building. But standing there among the dust and broken stone, I quietly promised myself they had not removed the truth. People always believe a home begins with a front door, but mine started with a promise. Standing in the middle of that empty lot, I closed my eyes for just a second and pictured exactly what had been there. Only 8 days earlier. Every measurement was still engraved in my memory. The living room stretched 24 feet across. The kitchen windows faced east, so the morning sun always reached the breakfast table before I finished my first cup of coffee. The wraparound porch measured exactly 9 feet wide because my father insisted there should always be enough room for 2 rocking chairs and a conversation. This was never just another house to me. My father and I built most of it ourselves after my mother passed away. We spent nearly 4 years working weekends, saving every extra dollar, pouring the foundation, raising walls, and finishing one room at a time. Even after becoming a structural engineer, I never hired someone to make major improvements because every project gave me another excuse to remember those years beside him. When he passed away, the property officially became mine, but it had always felt more like a responsibility than an inheritance. Before leaving for Arizona, I walked through every room like I always did before a business trip. I checked every window, adjusted the thermostat, locked the back door, and placed an old red fireproof document box inside the hall closet. It contained copies of the original building permits, engineering drawings, inspection certificates, property surveys, and every receipt from the years we spent building the place. My father used to joke that if anyone ever questioned the house, that box could tell its entire life story. At the time, I laughed because it sounded impossible that anyone would ever need that much paperwork. Now I wished I had carried the box with me instead of leaving it behind. My phone buzzed inside my pocket. It was my coworker, Daniel Ortiz, calling to ask if I had made it home safely after the long drive from the airport. I stared across the dirt and answered with a silence that lasted several seconds before I finally spoke. He immediately knew something was wrong. I told him the house was gone. At first he laughed, assuming I was making an exhausted joke after traveling all day. When he realized I was serious, his voice became quiet. He asked if there had been a fire or a storm. I looked around at the perfectly untouched neighborhood and answered with one word. No. He told me to take pictures of everything before touching anything, then reminded me of something every engineer understands. Evidence disappears faster than concrete dust after the wind starts blowing. I ended the call and slowly walked the perimeter of the foundation. Fresh bulldozer tracks crossed the yard. Bright orange survey paint marked the edges of the property. Wooden stakes with pink ribbons still stood in the ground, as though someone had carefully planned every step of what happened here. Nothing about this looked rushed or accidental. It looked organized. It looked scheduled. Most of all, it looked like someone believed they would never have to explain what they had done. Within 15 minutes, the quiet street no longer felt familiar. Neighbors who usually waved from their driveways now stood in small groups, speaking in low voices while pretending not to stare. Mrs. Henderson finally walked across the street with a worried expression and handed me a cold bottle of water. She looked at the empty lot before saying, "Nathan, I thought you knew." Those 5 words settled heavier than the Texas heat. I asked her what she meant, and she explained that 3 days after I left, several white pickup trucks with contractor logos had arrived early in the morning. They were followed by a meeting involving members of the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. According to what everyone had been told, my house had been declared an abandoned structure that violated community standards. Mrs. Henderson admitted that many neighbors questioned the decision because my lawn had always been maintained by a landscaping service whenever I traveled for work. My mail had been placed on hold through the United States Postal Service, and my truck was obviously gone because I was out of state. Nothing about the property suggested it had been abandoned. Still, the contractors continued working because they insisted they had official authorization. That was the first time I heard the name Linda Carrington that afternoon. She had served as president of the Homeowners Association for nearly 6 years and was known throughout the neighborhood for treating every rule as though it carried the force of law. She believed appearances came before everything else, and she often reminded homeowners that maintaining property values required firm decisions. I had attended only a handful of association meetings over the years because my work kept me traveling, but every interaction with Linda had followed the same pattern. She spoke with absolute confidence, expected immediate agreement, and rarely accepted questions. Even so, I had never imagined she would involve herself in something this extraordinary. Mrs. Henderson quietly added one detail that immediately caught my attention. The demolition crew had paused twice during the project because several workers questioned whether they had the correct address. Each time, Linda reportedly arrived carrying a folder and assured them everything had been approved. That sentence stayed with me. Approved by whom? A homeowners association could issue notices, fines, or maintenance requests, but demolishing a legally occupied home was an entirely different matter. Years of working with construction permits had taught me that projects involving structural removal required clear documentation, inspections, and authorization from local government authorities. None of those procedures happened overnight. As I stood there thinking through every step required for a lawful demolition, another neighbor walked over holding a tablet. His name was Kevin Morris, and he lived directly across the street. Without saying much, He turned the screen toward me. It showed a photograph he had taken 4 days earlier from his upstairs window. Bright orange fencing surrounded my property. Heavy equipment sat in the driveway, and Linda Carrington stood near the entrance speaking with a man wearing a contractor's hard hat while pointing toward my house. Kevin looked at me and said quietly, "Something about that meeting never felt right." I studied the image for several seconds before asking him to send me the original file. At that moment, I realized the empty foundation in front of me was only the beginning. Somewhere behind every machine, every signature, and every confident decision was a paper trail, and paper trails had a habit of telling the truth long after people stopped talking. By the time the sun dipped lower over Maple Ridge Estates, my truck had become a temporary office. The passenger seat was covered with handwritten notes, business cards from contractors I had worked with over the years, and every photograph my neighbors had shared. I had already learned one lesson that afternoon. Everyone remembered seeing the demolition, but nobody had seen a county inspector. That detail refused to leave my mind. I opened my laptop using the mobile hotspot on my phone and logged into the county public records portal. Years of reviewing construction permits for engineering projects had taught me exactly where to look. Demolition permits, environmental clearances, utility disconnect records, inspection reports, and contractor filings all left digital footprints. If my house had truly been removed through the proper legal process, there would be a trail. I searched my property address once. Nothing. I searched the parcel identification number. Still nothing. I expanded the search to include demolition permits issued during the previous 30 days throughout the neighborhood. My address never appeared. I refreshed the page twice because I assumed I had made a mistake. The result remained the same. There was no county demolition permit connected to my property. My pulse stayed calm, but my confidence grew stronger. This was no longer just an emotional loss. It had become a question of procedure, and procedures existed for a reason. A few minutes later, my phone rang again. The caller identified himself as Eric Nolan, the project manager for the demolition company. His number had been given to me by one of the workers still packing equipment. I expected him to deny responsibility, but instead he sounded surprisingly cooperative. He explained that his company had received a signed authorization package from the Maple Ridge Estates Homeowners Association along with written assurances that every required approval had already been secured. Their contract specifically stated that the association accepted responsibility for legal authorization. When I asked whether anyone from the county had visited the site before work began, Eric paused for several seconds before quietly answering, "Not that I ever saw." He even admitted that 2 supervisors questioned whether additional documentation should be requested because residential demolitions usually involve county oversight. According to him, those concerns were answered when Linda Carrington personally arrived with a binder full of documents and insisted everything had been reviewed. After the call ended, I looked back toward the empty foundation. The orange survey stakes suddenly caught my attention again. They were placed with remarkable precision, almost as if someone wanted the demolition to stop exactly at the property boundaries without disturbing neighboring lots. Whoever planned this operation had paid careful attention to construction details while overlooking something far more important. Authority could not be created simply because someone believed they had it. Just before leaving for the evening, Kevin Morris walked across the street carrying a small memory card inside a clear plastic case. He told me his security camera continuously recorded the front of the neighborhood entrance and part of my driveway. He had already copied every video from the week I was away because he had a feeling I might eventually need it. As I accepted the tiny memory card, it felt almost weightless in my hand, yet I could not shake the feeling that it carried something far heavier than its size suggested. Somewhere inside those recordings, the truth had been quietly waiting while everyone else focused on the pile of broken bricks. That night, I checked into a small hotel less than 5 miles from my neighborhood, but sleep never came. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still picture the empty foundation where my living room had been. Around 6 o'clock the next morning, I sat at the small desk beside the window with a laptop, a notebook, and the memory card Kevin had given me. Outside, the parking lot slowly filled with commuters starting another ordinary workday. Mine had become anything but ordinary. I inserted the memory card into my computer and opened the first recording. The security camera overlooked the entrance to Maple Ridge Estates with a clear view of every vehicle entering and leaving. The footage from the morning of the demolition immediately caught my attention. At exactly 7:12 in the morning, 3 contractor trucks entered the neighborhood followed by a bulldozer on a flatbed trailer. A few minutes later, Linda Carrington arrived in a silver sport utility vehicle carrying the same thick binder Kevin had mentioned. She spoke with the site supervisor for several minutes before pointing toward my property. Everyone nodded, climbed back into their vehicles, and drove away together. The video contained no audio, but body language often spoke louder than words. Nobody looked uncertain. Nobody appeared confused. They acted like every step had already been approved. I continued watching hour after hour of recordings, carefully writing down every arrival and departure time. Shortly after noon, another vehicle pulled into view. It belonged to a local utility contractor. That surprised me because proper demolition normally required utility disconnections before structural work began. I contacted the electric company and the water district that afternoon. Both representatives confirmed my service had been temporarily disconnected on the same day, but neither agency had received a county demolition order. Instead, they processed the request after receiving documentation submitted by an authorized third party. I asked each representative to preserve every record connected to my account. Both agreed. By midday, another important question remained unanswered. If the county never issued a demolition permit, exactly what documents had convinced the utility companies and the contractor to move forward? I decided it was time to speak directly with the Homeowners Association. Their office occupied a renovated clubhouse near the neighborhood entrance. The building looked immaculate, with trimmed hedges, polished stone walkways, and an American flag moving gently in the breeze. Everything projected order and professionalism. Inside, the receptionist greeted me politely. Until I introduced myself. The smile on her face faded almost instantly. She quietly informed me that Linda Carrington was unavailable because she was attending meetings throughout the day. When I asked for copies of any notices, board resolutions, or correspondence related to my property, she hesitated before saying those documents would require a formal written request. I thanked her, handed over my business card, and requested that nothing related to my property be destroyed or altered because legal review was likely. As I walked back toward the parking lot, I noticed a maintenance employee loading empty archive boxes into the back of a pickup truck beside the clubhouse. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it was simply routine office work. Still, after everything I had uncovered during the previous 24 hours, I had learned to pay attention to details that other people ignored. Sometimes the smallest movement happened just before the biggest mistake revealed itself. The next 48 hours tested my patience more than my confidence. I had enough pieces to know something had gone terribly wrong, but not enough to prove exactly how it happened. Every attorney I called asked the same question before anything else. Do you have documentation? I answered the same way every time. Not yet. One lawyer politely declined the case because he believed fighting a homeowners association with deep insurance coverage and multiple contractors could take years. Another suggested accepting a settlement if one was offered. Neither answer felt right. I was not interested in a quick check. I wanted the truth. Late that afternoon, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. The caller introduced herself as Rebecca Lawson, a construction attorney whose name had been passed along by Daniel Ortiz after speaking with several engineering clients. Instead of asking how much my house was worth, Rebecca asked one simple question. Has anyone shown you a signed county demolition permit? I told her no. She remained silent for a moment before saying, Then do not assume one exists. We met the following morning at her office downtown. I arrived carrying a binder filled with photographs, neighbor statements, utility records, and copies of everything I had gathered so far. Rebecca spent nearly an hour reviewing every page without interrupting. When she finally looked up, she slid one photograph back toward me. It showed Linda Carrington standing beside the contractor while holding the thick binder on demolition day. Rebecca tapped the picture gently. People usually hide mistakes, she said. Confident people often display them. She explained that if Linda truly believed she had legal authority, the documents inside that binder would reveal exactly where that belief came from. That made obtaining those records our highest priority. Before leaving her office, Rebecca instructed me to stop thinking like a homeowner and start thinking like the engineer I had always been. Engineers built timelines, not assumptions. Every permit, email, invoice, inspection, and utility request carried a date and a time. If we reconstructed every event in order, any missing step would become impossible to ignore. That afternoon, we submitted formal preservation notices to the Homeowners Association, the demolition company, the utility providers, and the county records office, requesting that all documents, electronic communications, meeting minutes, invoices, photographs, and digital files related to my property be preserved without alteration. Rebecca explained that preserving evidence early often mattered just as much as discovering it later. As we finished preparing the paperwork, another unexpected message arrived from Kevin Morris. He had remembered that one of his exterior security cameras automatically uploaded recordings to cloud storage instead of keeping only the local copies he had already given me. The cloud archive contained higher resolution footage with a wider field of view covering the entrance road. He believed it might show more vehicles arriving before work began. As I downloaded the files that evening, I felt the investigation quietly shifting. Until then, I had been reacting to what had already happened. Now, for the first time since returning home, it felt as though the facts were beginning to move in my direction, one carefully, documented step at a time. 3 days later, the first official responses began arriving, and they changed everything. Rebecca Lawson spread the documents across the conference table in her office with the careful precision of someone assembling a blueprint. Every page had a date, a signature, or a missing signature. Every missing detail mattered just as much as the ones that appeared in black ink. The Homeowners Association had responded to our preservation notice by producing copies of board meeting minutes, internal resolutions, and correspondence with the demolition contractor. At first glance, the paperwork looked complete. Linda Carrington had clearly documented the board's belief that my property had become a neglected structure that threatened neighborhood standards. They had voted to authorize corrective action. They had hired a contractor. They had approved payment. Everything inside their own organization appeared organized. Then Rebecca placed another document beside the stack. It was a certified letter from the county building department. The language could not have been clearer. The county had never issued a demolition permit for my property. They had never inspected the structure for demolition. They had never declared the house unsafe. They had never delegated that authority to the Homeowners Association. Rebecca looked at me and quietly said, "Their paperwork proves they made a decision. This proves they never had the legal power to make it." For the first time since returning home, I felt the weight on my shoulders begin to shift. We were no longer trying to prove that something unusual had happened. We now had government records confirming that a critical legal step simply did not exist. Later that afternoon, another response arrived, this time from the demolition company. Along with their contract, they included the authorization package Linda had presented before work began. Inside the binder were photographs of my property, copies of neighborhood rules, board resolutions, and a signed statement from the Homeowners Association claiming that all necessary governmental approvals had already been obtained. Rebecca immediately highlighted that sentence with a yellow marker. "This representation becomes very important," she explained. Someone placed that statement in writing. The next morning we met with Martin Hayes, a forensic construction consultant Rebecca frequently worked with. Martin spent more than 20 years investigating building failures, permit disputes, and construction litigation. Instead of focusing on what had disappeared, he carefully documented what remained. We walked across the empty foundation while he measured concrete edges, photographed utility connections, and examined survey stakes that had never been removed. He smiled slightly when he noticed several paint markings still visible beneath the dust. "These markings tell a story," he said. According to Martin, whoever prepared the site had invested considerable effort planning the demolition itself. The work reflected experienced contractors following a detailed sequence. Ironically, that level of organization strengthened our position because it demonstrated this was never an emergency decision made under unexpected circumstances. It had been planned days in advance. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the vacant lot, Martin finished packing his equipment before turning toward me. "Buildings leave evidence after they are gone," he said. "Sometimes more evidence than when they were standing." Looking across the foundation once again, I realized every stake, every photograph, every email, and every signature was beginning to connect into one complete timeline. And for the first time, that timeline was pointing directly toward the people who believed nobody would ever question what they had done. The lawsuit moved forward with a speed I had not expected because the facts were no longer built on opinions. They were built on documents. Over the following months, Rebecca Lawson assembled a case that looked less like a traditional legal argument and more like an engineering report. Every email, permit request, invoice, photograph, security recording, utility record, and board meeting minute was placed into a precise chronological timeline. Nothing was exaggerated because it did not need to be. The facts were already powerful enough. During the discovery process, additional electronic records began to surface. Internal emails between Linda Carrington and several board members revealed repeated discussions about my property while I was away on business. One message suggested waiting until I returned to request additional information. Another proposed moving forward immediately because delaying the project could create what they described as unnecessary complications for the neighborhood improvement plan. The most significant email arrived only 2 days before the demolition. A contractor representative asked whether the county demolition permit number should be included in the project file. Linda replied that the Homeowners Association had already approved the work and instructed the contractor to proceed according to the existing schedule. There was no county permit number attached because none existed. Rebecca quietly closed the folder after reading that message. "This is no longer about misunderstanding authority," she said. "This is about acting without it." Mediation was scheduled before the case reached trial. I walked into the conference room carrying nothing except a legal pad because every important document had already been exchanged. Linda Carrington sat across the table with attorneys, insurance representatives, and several members of the Homeowners Association board. For the first time since I had returned home, she avoided making direct eye contact. The mediator encouraged both sides to discuss possible settlement options. Rebecca calmly presented our timeline, beginning with my departure for Arizona and ending with the completed demolition. She never raised her voice. She simply matched every event with an official record. When the county letter confirming the absence of any demolition permit was placed on the table beside the contractor authorization package, the room became noticeably quieter. Martin Hayes then explained his forensic findings, describing how the carefully planned sequence of work demonstrated that the demolition had been organized well in advance rather than performed in response to any emergency condition. His testimony removed the final argument that the Homeowners Association had acted out of immediate necessity. After nearly 8 hours of discussion, the mediation ended without an agreement. As Rebecca and I walked toward the parking garage, I asked whether that outcome worried her. She smiled for the first time in weeks and answered, "Sometimes the strongest cases become stronger when everyone has to explain their decisions under oath." Several weeks later, depositions began. One witness after another confirmed pieces of the same timeline we had already assembled. Contractors relied on written authorization. Utility companies relied on submitted documentation. County officials confirmed they had never approved demolition. Every answer connected with another document already sitting inside our evidence binders. Standing outside the courthouse after another long day of testimony, I looked at the growing stack of organized files in the back seat of my truck. Months earlier, all I could see was an empty foundation covered in dust. Now I could finally see something else taking shape. It was not another building. It was the undeniable structure of the truth itself, and unlike my house, this foundation was becoming impossible for anyone to tear down. The day the judge announced the decision, the courtroom felt almost unnaturally quiet. There were no dramatic interruptions, no emotional speeches, and no surprises left to uncover. Everything that needed to be said had already been preserved in photographs, emails, permits, engineering reports, meeting minutes, and sworn testimony. The truth had spent months assembling itself one document at a time. When the judge began reading the findings, every sentence reflected the same conclusion. The Homeowners Association had acted outside its legal authority. No county agency had approved the demolition. No lawful permit had been issued. The contractor had relied upon written representations that proved to be inaccurate. Responsibility ultimately rested with those who authorized the project without possessing the power to do so. Then came the order that none of us would ever forget. The court required the responsible parties to rebuild my home to equivalent or better specifications using licensed professionals and current building standards. Every documented personal loss would be compensated. Additional financial damages were awarded because the evidence demonstrated that the decisions leading to the demolition had been deliberate rather than accidental. By the time every category of compensation was calculated, the total judgment approached $10 million. I did not celebrate inside the courtroom. I simply sat there for a moment, taking a slow breath that felt like the first complete breath I had managed since returning from Arizona months earlier. Rebecca Lawson quietly shook my hand before gathering the evidence binders that had filled so many conference tables throughout the case. Martin Hayes smiled, closed his notebook, and reminded me that careful documentation always outlasted confident assumptions. Over the following year, construction began again on the same foundation where everything had once been reduced to dust. This time, every permit was displayed exactly where it belonged. Every inspection was completed on schedule. Every contractor understood that the project represented more than rebuilding a house. It represented rebuilding accountability. I visited the site nearly every afternoon after work, watching new concrete cure beneath the Texas sun, fresh framing rise into place, and familiar rooms slowly return one measured wall at a time. When the front porch was finally completed, I asked the builders to match the original dimensions exactly, 9 feet wide, just as my father had insisted years before, leaving enough room for 2 rocking chairs and a conversation. One afternoon, while organizing the newly finished study, a delivery arrived from the recovery company hired during the legal process. Inside a carefully sealed container was the old red fireproof document box. It had survived after all. The papers inside carried dust around the edges, but every permit, every drawing, every inspection certificate, and every receipt remained intact. I placed the box on the highest shelf in the study where it belonged, not because I expected to need it again, but because it reminded me that truth often survives in quiet places long before anyone realizes its value. Sometimes people believe power comes from titles, committees, or signatures. My experience taught me something very different. Real authority comes from respecting the law, following the proper process, and remembering that no organization stands above the rules that protect everyone equally. Every time I sit on that front porch beneath the shade of the old oak tree, listening to the evening breeze move through its branches, I remember the empty foundation that once stood there. Then I look at the home built once by my father, rebuilt again through justice, and I quietly remind myself that foundations made of concrete can be replaced, but foundations built on truth are almost impossible to destroy.